Hello, this is another exciting episode of You.Gov. On the show, we try to tell you about government functions and responsibilities, as well as citizens' obligations. We also examine various concepts of government. We've looked at federalism, we've looked at democracy, and a whole lot of other concepts. We'll let you know what we're going to be looking at this week. Don't go away.
Love Plus app is bigger and better. Watch all our shows with just a click.
Let him have the right to decide what happens with your body.
Watch inspiring, informative, and entertaining programs. You can comment, like, and share. Watch our live TV and web TV on your mobile devices. Watch the big stories in real time or when you have the time. Experience Love Plus app right now. Download Love Plus app on Android, iOS, and BlackBerry. Go to Google Play Store, Apple App Store, or Windows Phone Store. Welcome to the bigger picture. Love Plus, beyond television. With every story comes an inside story, shaping thoughts, opinions, and driving the conversation. Nations, governments, economies, and even the environment. The causes, consequences, or benefits. The analysis makes it clear. We take a close look at every possible angle. No matter the story, we take you inside the news.
Inside the News, showing on the station.
The talk never stops, whether politics, leadership, or economies in Africa. The issues, the facts, and all the sides. Your views matter. Let's discuss.
Join us on the agenda, showing only on Love Plus.
You're welcome back. If you're just joining us, this is You.Gov, and this week we're going to be talking about separation of powers. I am Itohan Olomu-Agbodo, in case you're just joining us. And separation of powers was propounded by a foremost ancient philosopher. His name was Baron de Montesquieu. Montesquieu talked about separation of powers, separation of various functions of government among the various arms of government, like the legislature, the judiciary, and the executive. So in a normal government, in a democratic government, government functions are shared among these arms. Of course, we have respondents who will be telling us more on separation of powers. Stay tuned.
When we talk about the concept of separation of powers as propounded by Baron de Montesquieu, it also illustrates it just simply means that powers, governmental powers must be separated between various institutions of government. In essence, it simply means that to avoid a state of anarchy whereby political powers is enmeshed within a particular person or an institution. Separation of powers means that is various institutions of government, for instance, the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary must be independent, in the sense that those that make the law must be different from those that execute it, and those that enforce the law must be different from those that make it. That is just the concept of separation of power. And the gist of the concept of separation of power is simple: is to make sure that powers of government or the lawmaking bodies or the process of enforcing those laws is clearly defined and spelled out, and the process for enforcing those laws is also clearly spelled out. That is just the basic gist of the concept of separation of powers.
Separation of power means that the legislature, executive, and judiciary should be independent. There should not be interference between executive, and legislature and judiciary. The executive should not interfere with judiciary. Judiciary should not interfere with executive and the legislature and the election.
Separation of power entails or presupposes the fact that each organ of government should be separate and distinct from the other. Now, basically, there are three organs of government. You have the executive, you have the legislature, you have the judiciary. So, separation of power means that each of these organs of government should be different, should work differently, independently of the other, while also acting as checks on each other. So you cannot separate the doctrine of separation of powers from checks and balances. If you have separation of powers, then you have checks and balances, which also means that an organ of government can act as a check on the other. Like judiciary can act as a check on the legislature, while the legislature can act as a check on the executive. Now, you will notice that sometimes House committees that we have in our National Assembly, they invite certain personnel in the executive to come and explain or to come and shed light or illuminate some issues that are arising. So that in itself, it's an act of check on the executive, inviting them to come and lay clear or illuminate issues that have been bordering on the nation, or issues that they feel that it is pertinent that clearances are made on them for the better good of the whole country, and for correction of mistakes that may have been earlier made. So it is very, very important that you have separation of power in a country. You cannot have a situation where members of the judiciary will act, or they will usurp the powers of the legislature, and you cannot have a society where the legislature will usurp the power of the executive. In that kind of scenario, in that kind of situation, you cannot build a sane society, you cannot build a sane environment. So it is very, very important, it is imperative that in every society you have separation of powers, and where you have separation of powers, it is also important that you support it with checks and balances, so that everybody can act accordingly. Because if you know that somebody is checking you, you want to act appropriately. If you know that you can be chastised by the other arm of government, you want to do what is right. And that in itself is the foundation upon which a country is meant to be built.
If I want to take Nigeria as a subject or a subject matter, we have three arms of government, where you have the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. As much as there's separation of power, all the bodies, all the arms of government still have to work in tandem for the country to move forward. One cannot work, in isolation of the other. But what separation of power actually implies is that none of them interferes with the activities or with the powers that have actually been granted to the other, or the powers that the other can actually, implement, or that can exercise. So that's what the separation of power actually implies.
Amazing. Those were lawyers at the Ikeja High Court telling us what they understood by separation of powers. And indeed, it's from one level of knowledge to another. Basically, separation of powers entails distribution of powers among the arms, and it is to ensure that there are checks and balances and to avoid interferences between the various arms of government.
Well, the issue of separation of power is actually applicable in democracy. There are actually three arms of government. You have the executive, you have the legislative house, and you have the judiciary. They are supposed to be independent, and they also have to be separated, because they perform different functions in polity, but all geared towards giving the people of that particular state what they call good governance, and taking care of them, because the welfare and security of lives and property remains the primary purpose of governance and government. Now, the executive executes what the legislative assembly has actually passed as law, while the judiciary interprets the law. That's what they do. One interprets, one makes the law, and then one executes. And so that's what it means by separation. They are all separated. Now, when both of them begin to interfere with one another, they run into problem, because one's supposed to interpret, one's supposed to legislate, one's supposed to execute. And so they must be independent in order to carry out these three functions I've just mentioned effectively. But when it's muddled up, then you will run into problem. The executive, comprise, maybe in a democracy like ours, if you are at the national level, the president, the vice, his ministers, and special advisors and all that. Then the other agencies that work for the purpose of enforcement and execution. So this is the executive arm. Then the legislative assembly, like for us now, we have the Senate and we have the House of Reps. So it's a bicameral legislative assembly were operating. But in some countries, they operate only unicameral. Unicameral means one arm of legislative assembly. But in our case here, we have House of Reps and Senate. They must do things in a concurrent manner. In other words, if a law is passed by the House of Reps, they must also be passed by the Senate. Because the Senate is supposed to be composed of men who are older, who are more matured, whereas that of the lower house is composed of people who are younger. And of course, younger men, you know how their blood is always very hot, while the old men, they are more matured in taking a look at issues before they decide. And so we operate what we call bicameral legislative assembly. Now, in the issue of judiciary, they are the one that actually interpret the law. They are the one that ensure that the law enacted is given enforcement by way of interpretation. Because when they interpret now, the executive now would now enforce and execute. And so they are all separated, but they must also cooperate. Because if they are running, a parallel line in the sense of not cooperating at all, they may not be able to deliver dividends. They may not be able to give people good governance. Even though they are independent, even though they are separated, even though they are supposed to be, separated as separation of power, but they must also have this idea of policy direction in order to enthrone good governance for the overall interest of the people. So separation does not mean that they all run parallel line to everyone running his own, own show, to the detriment of the state. They must all run it in a manner that at the end there must be a meeting point, and the meeting point is to make sure that they deliver good dividends of democracy to the people. So that is in simple meaning what they mean by separation of power, and it's only in democracy. Of course, in military regime, it's a complete scenario entirely. There is no separation. In fact, the executive may even do the legislative function, and sometimes they interfere with judiciary. They oust some of the powers of the judiciary. They have ouster clauses in some of the decrees they enact. So there is no separation of power under the military regime or other forms of governance. But in democracy, that is when we begin to talk about three arms and then talk about separation of powers. Well, on paper, we can say that there is. In practice also, we can also say, but to a certain extent, because sometimes we see that things are muddled up at times. You find out that sometimes the executive will become interested who becomes the Senate president, or who becomes the Speaker of the House. At the state level also, who becomes the Speaker. Whereas it's supposed not to be that way. And the Legislative Assembly that's supposed to carry out an oversight function over the executive sometimes finds it very difficult because the executive controls the budget. So most of the time they use the money to actually intimidate them or make them to soft pedal in carrying out their functions. So in theory, they're supposed to be separated. They're supposed to be independent. They're supposed to function, for the sake of checks and balances. But we don't see it, here. The checks and balances is not more there because most of the time the institutions are very weak. We have institutions in Nigeria that are very, very weak. Even though some people have come here and spoken to us as a nation and said, for you to function as a country, for you to run, a system that is very effective, institutions must be very strong. You must have strong institutions. Your legislative assembly must be very strong. Your executive must be very strong. Your judiciary must be very strong. Because it's only when they are strong they can carry out their function in accordance with the law. But the moment they are not strong, they begin to pander. They begin to look at areas they're supposed not to look at in carrying out their functions. So I think we can't say that in Nigeria we are really operating a system that is perfect. In the real sense of that word, in democracy. They are not really independent. They are not really separated. They are not really carrying out the function of checks and balances the way it's supposed to be carried under a known democracy. So I cannot say that we're doing it right. So in giving mark, awarding mark, I would say 40% for us in terms of observing the separation of powers we just mentioned. So.
Wow, that was Barrister Ubani telling us what separation of powers is. And as I said, it's basically a distribution of functions of government among the various arms so as to create room for checks and balances. Of course, we have other respondents who will be telling us more on separation of powers. Don't go away.
Separation of powers, this was, if you like, an invention. We have three arms of government, the legislative arm, the executive arm, and the judicial arm, each of which must be independent of the other. Now, each one has functions that the others cannot perform and should not perform. The judiciary, for example, adjudicates on issues brought before it. And when it adjudicates, no other arm, such as the executive and the legislative arm, should interfere, should intervene in the process of adjudication. Never. Now, just so that the executive arm, let me begin with the legislative arm, makes the laws. And nobody, or either the judicial arm or the executive arm, has the right to make laws. It is only the legislative arm. Now, when the legislators have made laws, the executive arm executes such laws. And in executing such laws, the legislative arm cannot come into it. Neither should the judicial arm come into it. All these are, enshrined in sections 4, 5, and 6 of the Constitution. Now, in other words, Section 4 gives all the powers of legislation to the legislature, that is, to the House Representatives and to the Senate. That is Section 4. Section 5 gives all the executive powers to the executive, and while Section 6 gives all the judicial powers to the judiciary. So that's what we call separation of powers. Each one does its own, performs its own function, to the eternal exclusion. Well, I don't think it's right to say to the eternal exclusion, because there are times when it is not eternal. To the exclusion of the others. Legislative arm performs its own differently, the judicial arm performs its own differently, and the executive arm performs its own differently. Checks and balances. For example, it is the president that appoints the Chief Justice of Nigeria, for example. He appoints after he has been recommended to him by the NJC, the National Judicial Council. Now the president appoints, and usually the most senior, member of the Supreme Court as the Chief Justice of Nigeria. So you can now see, in appointing the Chief Justice of Nigeria, the executive is more or less interfering in the functions of the judiciary. And the judiciary can set aside any legislation that is unconstitutional. Any legislation coming from the legislative arm, the judiciary can set it aside. And for example, that when a matter is in court, the Attorney General of the Federation can apply the nolle prosequi, can just throw in a nolle prosequi. In other words, this case should stop. That is interfering with the functions of the judiciary. So, there are checks and balances, such as this.
Well, interesting. We've had knowledgeable speakers telling us what separation of powers is. And as I said, it's basically about distribution of various functions among the arms of government. And it creates a system where there are checks and balances. One arm of government cannot interfere in the functions of others. But of course, we always go to the streets to find out responses from other people.
Separation of power has to do with, as the name implies, separation of power. It has to do with power not being concentrated on one arm of government, but it is divided, meaning it is divided between the judiciary, legislative, and the executive arm of government. So power, they all have different functions and different powers, responsibility bestowed upon them by the state. So separation of power has to do basically with the separation of power within different arms. So they have different responsibilities and different activities to carry out with their own rules and principles.
Separation of power is the function of power in Nigeria. It is the sharing of powers among the arms of government in Nigeria.
Separation of powers in our dear country, Nigeria, should be starting from the federal government, state, then local. Our local government in Nigeria should be independent they shouldn't be directly depending on the state government, so that some things that are important might be done even without consulting the governors. Generally, I'm talking about sharing of powers among the three arms of government, which are, to me, the federal, the legislature, the judiciary.
Local Plus app is bigger and better. Watch all our shows with just a click.
Let him have the right to decide what happens with your body.
Watch inspiring, informative, and entertaining programs. You can comment, like, and share. Watch our live TV and web TV on your mobile devices. Watch the big stories in real time or when you have the time. Experience Lovewell Plus app right now. Download Lovewell Plus app on Android, iOS, and BlackBerry. Go to Google Play Store, Apple App Store, or Windows Phone Store. Welcome to the bigger picture. Lovewell Plus, beyond television. With every story comes an inside story, shaping thoughts, opinions, and driving the conversation. Nations, governments, economies, and even the environment. The causes, consequences, or benefits. The analysis makes it clear. We take a close look at every possible angle. No matter the story, we take you inside the news.
Inside the News, showing on the station.
Interesting. These people on the streets are not just ordinary people. They are people that understand what separation of powers really mean. Now we have some tidbits that I would like you to see. Stay tuned. This is still You.Gov. Before we go this week, we'd like to hear from you. We send questions every week to our page on King's Chat. Just go hashtag You.Gov and send your contributions to our page. Last week our question was, who was a proponent of separation of powers? That is the topic that we discussed today, separation of powers. So we got 3 responses. 3 people actually got it right. They are Didier, Toju, and Alfonso. Thank you so much for sending your contributions to us. This week our question is, list the arms of government. You know, we're talking about separation of powers, we're talking about checks and balances and other concepts. So we want you to list the arms of government, usually the arms in a democratic government. You can send your contributions, your answers to hashtag You.Gov on our King's Chat page. I remain yours sincerely, Olomu-Agbodo. And I say bye for now. See you same time next week. God bless you.